Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Jonathan Reeves stood still in the sterile, metallic room, his eyes scanning the array of unfamiliar machines before him. This wasn't how he had imagined retirement. In the months after losing the presidential election, he had envisioned quiet evenings, reflecting on his years in office, maybe even writing a memoir. But instead, the country no, the world had other plans. Defeat was bitter, but it paled in comparison to this, being uploaded, not into history, but into a virtual world that mirrored the chaos outside. "You will still be of service, Mr. President," they had told him, though the tone was more clinical than hopeful. The scientists explained the intricacies of the simulation platform, how his consciousness would guide future political leaders through various crisis scenarios. The next generation would need his experience, they insisted. Yet no one mentioned what would happen if the real world started to crumble. No one ever imagined the global network at the heart of communication, economy, governance would collapse so fast. As Reeves' consciousness settled into the virtual platform, the first few days were strange but manageable. The world built for him was a close approximation of Washington, D.C., but without the pulse of life it once had. No aides, no bustling halls, just hollow, digital replicas. He wasn't alone, though. He had company, in the form of young leaders who were thrust into the platform with him, ready to train, eager to learn. It was these faces that now occupied his attention. Lena Morales, the first to arrive, stood in front of him. Her expression was a mixture of uncertainty and determination. She was young, maybe 25, with fierce brown eyes and the energy of someone who hadn't yet been worn down by bureaucracy. "President Reeves, I've read everything about your tenure," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to make a difference." Reeves studied her, nodding slowly. "You will, Lena. But making a difference means understanding that change is never simple. Are you ready to learn that?" She nodded, though Reeves knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for her. Behind Lena stood Ethan Graves and Haruto Yamada, the other two students in the program. Ethan had a military bearing, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and an air of skepticism about him. Haruto, the quiet one, appeared far more interested in the technology surrounding them than in politics. They were an odd trio, representing different ideologies and approaches to leadership. And yet, they were the future. The early training sessions were straightforward enough. Crisis simulations began with small, manageable scenarios of natural disasters, political negotiations, small-scale conflicts. Reeves guided them through each, offering advice based on his years in office. Lena often pushed for diplomatic solutions, even when faced with aggressive opposition. Ethan, predictably, leaned toward military action, while Haruto focused on technological solutions, often suggesting that data and I could mitigate most issues. But as the days went by, things started to change. It was subtle at first: minor glitches in the simulation, brief interruptions in the flow of events. Reeves noticed, but didn't think much of it. Virtual worlds were bound to have bugs, after all. But the glitches became more frequent, and with them, Reeves started to feel something strange within his own consciousness. He could sense the boundaries of the virtual world in ways he hadn't before, as if he were beginning to merge with the code itself. One morning, during a particularly tense simulation of a global economic collapse, everything froze. The world around them halted, and the sky overhead flickered. Reeves stood in the center of it all, feeling something tugging at his mind. "What the hell is going on?" Ethan barked, his military instincts kicking in. Haruto tapped furiously on his wrist device, trying to diagnose the problem. "It's a broken barn, not just a glitch," he muttered. "The real-world systems they're collapsing." Reeves turned to face them, his expression grave. "Explain." Haruto sighed, his fingers still working as he brought up the holographic display. "The global network. It's falling apart. Communications, infrastructure, everything is going offline. This isn't just a simulation issue, it's real." Lena stepped forward, panic in her eyes. "So what does that mean for us? For the training? Can't we leave this world?" "No," Haruto replied, shaking his head. "We're trapped here until the systems stabilize. If they daunt a broken bar, we're stuck," Ethan finished, his voice tight. "And the real world will descend into chaos." Reeves absorbed the news in silence, his mind racing. His body might have been left behind, but his consciousness was here, and now, he understood something that hadn't been explained to him when he first entered the platform. He wasn't just a mentor to these young leaders, he was the last bastion of leadership for the entire world. If the virtual world collapsed, if the system that housed his consciousness failed, the new generation would have no guidance. Society would crumble. "I'm going to need all of you to listen carefully," Reeves said, his voice calm but commanding. "This is no longer a training exercise. The world outside is falling apart, and we are the only ones with the tools to prevent complete collapse." Lena looked confused. "But how? We're just simulations here. How can we affect the real world?" Reeves turned to Haruto. "Is there any way to re-establish some kind of control? Use the simulation to guide what's left of the global network?" Haruto paused, considering the possibilities. "Theoretically, yes. The virtual system still has links to the real world's infrastructure. If we can stabilize the simulation, I might be able to reroute control to the remaining functional systems. It's risky, though. The system's on the verge of crashing entirely." Ethan's voice cut in, sharp and clear. "We don't have time for theory. We need action. If the outside world is as bad as it sounds, we need to act now. Use force, if necessary, to re-establish order." "That's your answer to everything, isn't it?" Lena snapped, stepping toward him. "Violence isn't going to save us." "It might be the only thing that can," Ethan shot back. "Enough," Reeves interjected, silencing them both. He had seen this dynamic play out before, in cabinet meetings, war rooms, and during his presidency. Ideals clashed with pragmatism, each side convinced they were right. But now, there was no room for bickering. "We don't have time to argue," Reeves continued. "We need to find a solution that incorporates all of your strengths." "Ethan, we'll need military strategies to maintain order, but we can't rule by force alone." "Lena, diplomacy will be essential in rebuilding alliances." "Haruto, your expertise with technology will be crucial for stabilizing the network." Haruto nodded, his eyes scanning the digital interface in front of him. "I'll do what I can, but we're running out of time. The system is degrading rapidly." Reeves felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was no longer about training future leaders. It was about saving what remained of civilization, both inside and outside the virtual world. As the simulation world flickered around them, Reeves gathered his steam. The collapse of the global network was inevitable, but if they played their cards right, they might just be able to steer humanity through the crisis. It was no longer about politics or elections. This was about survival. Reeves watched as the simulation flickered again, the cracks in the virtual world widening. His thoughts raced. The weight of the situation was almost unbearable, but he couldn't afford to falter. Not now, not when everything real or simulated was at stake. The three young leaders standing before him were waiting for his direction, their trust in him palpable despite their disagreements. They were the future, but without him, they wouldn't be able to hold the crumbling pieces together. "Haruto," Reeves said, his voice firm. "We need a plan to stabilize the system, fast." "What do you need?" Haruto's fingers flew over the controls. "I can bypass the damaged systems, reroute some of the core functions, but it's going to be tight. The real world network is failing faster than I expected, and our connection to it is unstable. If I push too hard, everything could collapse." Reeves nodded, understanding the gravity of the risk. "We don't have a choice." "Do what you can." As Haruto worked, Lena stepped up next to Reeves. "Mr. President, if we do manage to get through this, what happens next? Society is already collapsing out there. How do we bring people back together?" Reeves looked at her, admiring her optimism but knowing the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. Lena, rebuilding trust after everything that's happened won't be easy. Diplomacy will be critical, but we're going to have to combine it with decisive action. People are scared, and fear leads to chaos. We'll need to show strength, but not in a way that alienates or oppresses. I can do that, Lena said, though doubt flickered in her eyes. I just hope the world outside is ready to listen. Ethan, who had been standing apart, his arms crossed, finally spoke. Talking won't be enough. People won't listen to reason when they're fighting for survival. We need to take control, get them to fall in line, or we'll lose everything. Reeves turned to face him. You're right that we can't just talk our way out of this. But control through fear alone will only lead to more unrest. We need balance, a military force to maintain order, yes, but also diplomacy and hope to give people a reason to trust us again. Ethan didn't respond immediately, but the hard set of his jaw suggested he wasn't convinced. Still, he remained silent, a small sign of concession. Let's not forget, Haruto interrupted, his voice strained as he continued working, if we don't stabilize the network, none of this will matter. We won't have a platform to communicate with anyone. Reeves knew Haruto was right. Everything hinged on this moment. They had to save the virtual world first before they could hope to save the real one. Minutes passed in tense silence, the digital sky above them flickering more violently. The cracks in the virtual landscape grew wider, threatening to tear the entire simulation apart. Haruto's brow furrowed in concentration as he worked against the clock. I've almost got it, Haruto muttered. Suddenly, the world around them surged, the flickering stabilizing for a brief moment. Reeves felt a strange sensation in his mind, as if his consciousness were expanding, stretching to fill the gaps left by the failing system. He could see beyond the immediate simulation glimpses of the real world, chaotic and on the verge of collapse. Entire cities darkened as power grids failed, governments scrambled to regain control, and people were left to fend for themselves. We're running out of time, Reeves said, urgency creeping into his voice. We need to reach the outside world now. Haruto made one final adjustment, and the simulation around them seemed to solidify. There, he said, panting slightly. I've rerouted enough of the system to buy us some time. But we're not out of the woods yet. The connection to the real world is barely holding on. Reeves nodded. That's all we need. Lena, Ethan, Haruto, you all have a role to play now. Lena, you need to start reaching out to what remains of global governments. Find allies who are willing to listen and work together. Ethan, you're in charge of security. Keep the peace, but don't provoke unnecessary violence. Haruto, maintain the systems as best you can, and try to rebuild the global communication network. The three leaders exchanged glances, understanding the gravity of their task. They knew the odds were against them, but under Reeves' guidance, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. Suddenly, a loud alarm echoed through the simulation. Haruto's eyes widened in alarm as a new set of red warnings flashed across his screen. What now? Reeves asked, his heart sinking. The rogue faction, Haruto replied grimly. They've broken through the firewall and are launching an attack on the system. They're trying to take control of the remaining network infrastructure. Ethan stepped forward, his expression hardening. We have to stop them. This isn't just a simulation anymore, yet they'll use whatever's left of the real world systems to seize power. Reeves knew Ethan was right. The rogue faction, likely made up of remnants of authoritarian regimes and rogue military groups, saw the global collapse as an opportunity to seize control, and if they succeeded, any hope of rebuilding a democratic society would be lost. Ethan, Reeves said, his voice low and determined, you're going to lead the counterattack. Use whatever military force you need, but remember this isn't just about winning. It's about preserving the future. Ethan nodded, his face set with grim determination. He turned and marched off to prepare his forces, leaving Reeves with Lena and Haruto. Mr. President, Lena said quietly, I'm not sure we can win this fight. Reeves placed a hand on her shoulder. We have to. We don't have a choice. As Ethan's forces clashed with the rogue faction in a brutal virtual war, Lena began reaching out to what remained of the world's leaders, pleading with them to cooperate and rebuild. Haruto worked tirelessly to stabilize the systems, keeping the network online just long enough to allow communications to flow. Reeves watched it all unfold, his mind feeling more and more detached from the virtual world as the strain on his consciousness increased. He could feel himself slipping, the boundaries between his mind and the digital landscape blurring. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, though time in the virtual world had lost much of its meaning. Ethan's forces managed to repel the rogue faction, but not without heavy losses. Lena had secured the cooperation of several world leaders, and Haruto had successfully reconnected the global network, though it was far from stable. But even as the virtual world stabilized, Reeves knew his time was running out. I've done all I can, Haruto said, exhausted. The network's holding, but it won't last forever. Reeves felt a sharp pain in his head, a sign that his consciousness was reaching its limit. He looked at the three young leaders who stood before him: Lena, Ethan, Haruto, all of them weary but still standing, still fighting. You've done well, Reeves said softly. But now it's up to you. I can't hold on much longer. Lena's eyes filled with tears. Mr. President, we can't do this without you. Reeves smiled faintly. Yes, you can. You're ready. Everything you need is inside you now. As the world around them shimmered one final time, Reeves felt his consciousness begin to fade. He had given everything he could, sacrificed himself to ensure that the new generation could lead humanity out of the darkness. With his final thought, Reeves whispered, "Lead them well." And then, he was gone. Lena, Ethan, and Haruto stood in silence, their mentor's last words echoing in their minds. The virtual world was stable, for now, and the real world had a chance to rebuild. Together, they turned toward the future, ready to lead humanity through the ashes of a broken world, just as Reeves had taught them.